In the last few days, I've been obsessing over sand simulation. I vaguely remember my friend Corey once showing me a game on his computer where he could place different blocks and they'd interact in interesting ways. Then I told him I already knew about Minecraft, so he showed me another game he knew about called Powder Toy. Powder Toy was a cellular automaton game, similar to the likes of Game of Life and Wire World. A 2D grid of cells, with each cell having a specified state and rules on how it will change over time. In Game of Life, for example, there are 4 basic rules which create surprising complexity out of the 2 basic states, alive or dead. The rules are: any live cell with fewer than 2 live neighbors dies. Any live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors lives. Any live cell with more than 3 live neighbors dies, and any dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes a live cell. And people have built all sorts of contraptions just from these 4 basic rules. Anyways, Powder Toy follows some different rules, unique to each element in the simulation. From now on, I'll talk about them as particles, since that's what they're called in my codebase. I started by making the ability to create textures dynamically, split into chunks, so that in the future I would be able to not render chunks that weren't visible to the player. Each chunk only knew about its own contents, and was responsible for its own rendering. Time to move on to painting particles. Speaking of which, my first attempts were less than impressive. For someone doing seemingly endless maths in uni, it took a while for me to find the particle I was hovering over with the mouse. At one point I was so stumped I started doing maths in Notepad out of frustration and disbelief. After hours of continuous anger and frustration, I triumphed over this villainous foe. And now I had a budget MS Paint. My girlfriend promptly drew me and her playing pool while listening to music, and naturally, when a project starts going well, it no longer does. I cranked the number of chunks way up and wanted to draw a bigger picture. The frame rate was noticeably lower, but I thought that was expected. Then this happened. In hindsight, I should have known something was wrong instantly. Since we aren't even updating any of the chunks, just drawing on them when the mouse is clicked, the frame rate change shouldn't be so drastic. The problem came with how Unity handles textures. For each chunk, I was creating a new texture every frame, and a new sprite out of that to show to the renderer. Each texture is 16 by 16 pixels with 4 bytes, totaling around, 4 kilobytes? With a grid of 10 by 10 chunks, the total memory usage was expected to be 100 chunks with 4 kilobytes each, around 400 kilobytes, not including overhead. So why was my computer promptly going bananas and using 8 gigs worth of RAM? Well, funny story actually. When setting a new texture, Unity doesn't garbage collect the old texture, so every frame the textures were never deleted from memory. Thus, instead of using 400 kilobytes all up, the rendering took up 400 kilobytes per frame. Roughly 300 frames per second, that's 120 megabytes per second. I could only run my game for 1 whole minute before the screen gave up on me. And here's how I fixed that. That's it. This one took me a while. That seems to be the general trend throughout this video though, so I'm guessing you're not surprised. Next up was movement. I tried making sand full Tetris style, and of course that didn't work for whatever reason. And naturally, on this day I wasn't feeling my best, so instead of trying to find the root cause of the issue, like any good programmer, I deleted everything and started over. Yep. This time I'd make things right, I told myself. These trivial problems wouldn't concern me anymore. Yeah. Did some reading, read up on public static and why they're bad, thought about brushes and how I would implement masks, did a bit more planning this time, and then it's go time. Again. Same idea, so I won't bore you with the details, but this time I didn't split it up into chunks, I'll do that later, and rendering was done on one texture as a result. Time to add movement again. This time, since everything is one big map, the math was trivial, but I'll have to move over to chunks in the future anyways for performance boost. I think that majority of future videos will be focused on performance and such, since that is what limits how big the world can be, and for my grand future plans, the world will have to be quite big indeed. Finally it worked, and I got something resembling sand, sort of. The rules for this are pretty straightforward. If a sand particle has nothing below it, move down. Also in the future, I'm thinking of changing this to be weight-based, so that instead of nothing being below, a particle has to be heavier than the one below it in order to move down. This would allow me to add more complex behavior in the future, like heavy gases falling to the bottom while lighter gases would fly to the top. I added some more rules to have sand have more substance by moving left and right if there's nothing below, causing it to make these pyramid-like structures. The order in which particles move is a bit buggy in this clip, but I didn't realize until later. The order in which particles are updated is actually really important for this kind of simulation, since we don't want to accidentally update the same particle twice, but we also want particles to have equal opportunity to fill a certain space. Since I'm all about the minimum viable product, a certain feature was needed in order for my eyes to not burn looking at plain yellow particles for the rest of my existence. One of the problems that I was facing at this point was the order of moves. If the order in which sand travels is random, why was the pyramid filling up the right side faster than the left? I have an itch that it's because I was moving left to right when iterating, so I just made particles update in a random order. This ensures that all particles have equal opportunity to fill a gap, at least pseudo, but causes the brush to behave a bit weird. This won't really matter in the scheme of things, but just something to consider. I'll keep researching and see if I can find a better way to do this, but if you have any ideas, let me know. I also made a UI bar on the bottom, which lets you select the particle you want to draw. For now, these are pulled from an array that I have to add to manually every time I create a new particle, but I'll make it automatic in the future since my monkey brain can't remember past last Thursday. In the end, I had 4 different particles, including sand, dirt, floating stone, as well as water. Liquids behave similar to solids, except they can slide across left to right to mimic the way liquids in the real world fill the gap. Once again, I'm not too happy with how this turned out. It's okay, but I can definitely find some more improvements to make water disperse faster. And I also want to implement pressure in some form. Also, another problem with my implementation right now is that I update every particle no matter what, but really, particles should only be updated if they're likely to move. For example, water at the bottom of a pond is unlikely to move in the next frame unless a hole arises in the bowl. These kind of optimizations will come next video. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe. It helps me out a ton and motivates me to get the next video out soon. Cheers.
I don't even know your name. Oh, still think about you every day. When you're passing by, I lose my mind. I lose my mind. Just to veil the secrecy.